I'm James Powell, welcome. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Thomson Reuters, and today is another of our TechVision talks, the first one of 2015. TechVision is designed to be interactive, so the important thing is to ask questions, right? So listen to Michael, but get ready to have a conversation. And Michael is particularly eager to do that, so I'm really looking forward to today. We have a fairly full house. I'm not sure if it's Michael that's the drawer or the free pizza afterwards.
Please let it be me.
We try and pick topics which are interesting to Thomson Reuters, which are relevant to Thomson Reuters when we're deciding what to run on this program. And I think innovation is something that's very important to Thomson Reuters. You've seen a lot of conversation around that, around the transformation initiatives inside the organization. Innovation means many things, and I think takes many forms, and it's always a lively debate about what the right way to drive innovation inside the company and with our customers. So I'm really looking forward to new ideas, new approaches. Michael's recent book, expresses some really interesting ideas, I think, which challenge some of our thinking as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. Mentioned Michael Schrage is a provocative thought leader on innovation. He's a research fellow at the MIT Sloan School Center for Digital Business and a Trust Entrepreneurship Center, a visiting fellow with Imperial College Business School, and a columnist for Harvard Business Review, Fortune Magazine, CIO Magazine, and MIT's Technology Review. The latest book, which most of you have, is called The Innovator's Hypothesis and looks at how to develop innovation in a quick, cost-effective way. So please welcome Michael Schrage.
Thank you, James. I would also like to thank Kathleen Held and Mona Vernon for facilitating the invitation here. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here. And as James introduced, I really look forward to this being as much a conversation as a presentation. The title of the talk is Rethinking Innovation Investment. And I'm really looking to explore and discuss with you mechanisms for aligning what innovation means and what investment means. And what changes, which is at the bottom of this, is I'm going to argue there's a different economics of experimentation that needs to fundamentally alter how we perceive risk and reward when we invest in experimentation and in innovation management. But I'd like to begin with my most important slide. The content of the audience is more important than the content of the talk. I have, unless I go off on an improvisational riff, a near-perfect knowledge of what I'm going to be saying this morning. I am much more interested in your reaction to it. I will say, just to warn you, there are probably two things I'm going to say this morning that will irritate you. There may be more, but there are two I'm fairly sure of. One is I will be spending a little bit of time talking about cultural issues. And the other, nobody recoiled at that. And the other is I will be quoting Warren Buffett. Uh-oh. That you react to? Boy. Okay, just by way of quick background, what is my area of interest in research? I do work in the behavioral economics of enterprise experimentation, innovation, and network effects. And the medium through which I view these things and do research are the models, prototypes, and simulations that organizations build, and the experiments they run with those models, prototypes, and simulations. As my wife and several former girlfriends will say, I am not by nature a people person. This will become clearer as it goes on, and I think that is consistent with the MIT brand in that regard. That said, some of my best friends are people, and you all are people, and I do feel that there's the behavioral economics aspect of it underscores that I really do care about how people actually behave with and engage with these themes and with these techniques. My advisory and consulting work, which in fact is going to offer some sort of narrative spine or arc here, is I help organizations design fast, frugal, and this is key, high-impact business experiments that make innovation simpler. I'm not into complexity management. Safer, I am into risk management, and scalable. It's not enough to have proof of concept if it doesn't scale, particularly for your global organization. So that makes the design of experiment as much a craft as a science, because these are constraints that you are designing within, and whenever you have constraints, you have trade-offs that have to be managed. And I address those in the book that Many of you have, and if you don't have, I urge you to consider doing so. So what is this talk really about? Yes, this is a talk about innovation, but it's really a talk about investing in innovation. I'm talking with Thomson Reuters. I think this is on the short list of companies and organizations that understand and care about what it means to be a good investor and the role of information and analysis in managing innovation opportunity and innovation risk. I mentioned the word innovation. James talks in the introduction that people have different perspectives on it. This is my definition of innovation. Innovation is the conversion of novelty into value. It's an operationally oriented definition. So if somebody says this is an important innovation, you can now divide it like Gaul into 3 parts. What's the novelty? What's the value and who gets it? And what's the conversion process therein? And I think there's an implicit issue here, which is novel and valuable to whom? Is it innovation, new value within the enterprise, or for customers, partners, and suppliers? But this is the definition of innovation that I use, and so you're welcome to disagree with it, but this is the one I'd like you to have in the back of the mind when I use that I word. The other point, which I cannot stress or overstress too highly, and this is kind of irritates some of my colleagues, innovation is not a goal. Innovation is a means to an end. Innovation is a means to an end. If the simple Gedanken experiment I could offer is, if Thomson Reuters can achieve compounded annual growth rates of double digits without doing any innovation, you're not going to be investing a lot in innovation. It's a means to an end. So the question we have to ask ourselves, and we can talk about this in the conversation, I hope we do, is, what's our strategic end? What's the objective? Is innovation a spice? Is it an ingredient? Is it the whole meal? I swear to you, when organizations call it, Michael, we need to become more innovative, my immediate response is not, that's wonderful, how much do you pay? My immediate reaction is, what for? To what end do you wish to be innovative? What is your strategic intent and then purpose? What are the desirable outcomes? To what extent is innovation a means and medium to achieving that strategic end? So I think one of the great things about innovation is that if you do it right, it forces a more articulate and more coherent discussion about strategic vectors, outcomes, and desires. Yes, at MIT, if you deliver an innovative, you get tenure. And as I mentioned in the book, yes, thank you for that point. There's a very important point, and this is, I refer to it in passing in the book. I'm happy to develop it further with you. But how many of you read science journals, by any sense, science and technology journals? So it's a good amount. Let me tell you what you never, ever, 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 ever find in scientific journals. Or at least I have not found, and I've been doing this for 20 plus years. You don't find budgets. Right? Everybody in this room, you got to live with a budget. When you do peer review, the budgets are relevant to this. Not to worry, it's going to be very relevant for this conversation, but it's also one of the reasons why people, quite understandably in the academic community, have a different notion of innovation as a deliverable versus innovation as a means to an end on this. And again, that's exactly why we're having this conversation. And in fact, I hope that you will like this, because I'm talking about experimentation here. Experiment as a means to an end. Experiment as means and medium and mechanism for value discovery and creation. What kind of investment is it? Okay, experiments are a medium, for the purposes of the talk, are a medium for that means. How should we invest in experiments as that medium to the means? And in science, what is experimentation in science? Experiment in science is a search for the truth. The truth. And I'm happy to be in a crowd where I can use the word epistemology, but I won't dwell on it. But we're not here doing science. We're here doing business. So where experiment in science is a search for truth, experiment in business is a search for value. I am here to say that as much as I love the truth, it is not synonymous with value. And value is not synonymous with the truth. So even though some of the mechanisms and means and techniques may be the same, experimentation as a medium for value is different than experimentation as a means for truth discovery. And I think one of the interesting challenges that everybody in this room faces is what level of overlap is there between the experiments we do to understand something better and experimentation to gain keener insight into value creation and discovery. And so my challenge that I want to address in my time here is organizationally, operationally, and culturally, are you appropriately investing in experiments and experimentation, depending upon what your desired strategic outcomes and ends and financial outcomes and ends are? What is my call to action and takeaway? What would I like to see manifest over the next 100 days, say by June 1? I want you to experiment with experimenting. But I don't want you to launch a big top-down initiative. I want you to enable simple, quick, and cheap exploration with the notion of what does it mean for our culture and operations to experiment with experimenting. What kind of innovation conversations, value creation and discovery conversations do we want to create? What kind of innovation experimentation should be encouraged from the top and facilitated from the middle and the bottom? So what's a quick structure for the talk today? I want to talk about experiments as investments. Okay, it's an investment. An experiment is an investment. Yeah, there's a bit of rhetoric in that, but that's the organizing principle I want you to consider. I want to talk about experimentation as a discipline. What does that mean as a process? What does it mean as a culture? And I want to talk about experimentation as a future. That is to say, as we look 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out, what kind of role does experimentation, writ large or writ small, play in the way we do Thomson Reuters does value creation, value discovery, and scale it. Okay? I'm from Hyde Park. I'm a University of Chicago kind of guy, which really pisses off the MIT people, but that's a separate conversation. Sorry for using the P word there, but it's the appropriate one in this context. And some of you may be familiar with Thomas Friedman. God, talk about a Freudian slip. That has to be edited out big time. Milton Friedman. And everybody knows the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, I'm a big believer in just as there's no such thing as a free lunch, there's no such thing as a riskless innovation. There are always trade-offs. And you can have wonderful innovations and not understand the risks associated with them. 8 or so years ago, we had that. We ran that. We had a lot of people being very innovative, and we had risk management. And so we had people at the very tops of organizations who didn't quite understand the instrument innovation and didn't quite understand risk management doing oversight on their integration. Didn't work out so well. So I think we want to take innovation risk management seriously from the get-go. Okay, so I'm linking that deliberately, and experimentation should be treated not just as a vehicle to explore new value creation, but to have greater insight into potential risks associated with that. So here's Mr. Buffett. I will shamelessly or shamefully name drop. In a previous life, I was a reporter for the Washington Post back in the days before Jeff Bezos owned it. And God, that's a difficult thing for me to believe and say at this time. And Mr. Buffett was on the board of the Washington Post company. And one of the perks, and I didn't realize what a great perk it was at the time, was that we could call up Mr. Buffett on deals that he was involved with, and he would give us access before the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Buffett was the rich uncle I never had as a child. And he was a terrific, wonderful, charming guy. If you don't read his shareholder letters, you really should. And he was always good for a quote, very pithy, very precise, very insightful. And not to me, but in some of his comments, he was asked to define value investing. And he said, value investing is how do you buy $1 for 50 cents? Because anybody can buy $1 for $1. And buying $1 for 85 or 95 cents doesn't give you much of a return or margin of error there. And so I thought that was a nice, simple definition. And in the spirit of good artists borrow, great artists steal, as I was doing work on the nature of innovation, and that was one of my beats at the Post, I became interested in the notion of value innovating. How do we get $1's worth of innovation, insight, information, risk management for 50 cents? less. So just as a trick question, because we have a nice crowd here, what do you call spending $2 for $1's worth of innovation? Going out of business? That is, of course, technically correct, but wrong. Sorry? Okay. Who else? Waste. Good. Failed experiment. Very nice. A teacher's pet kind of response. No. Now, what do you get? What do you call spending $2 for $1's worth? What? Stupid. Stupid? No, but you got the first two letters right. It's called strategic. Ah, good, the rueful laughter. Clearly McKinsey has been doing work with Thomson Reuters here. Okay, I don't believe in that. I don't believe that you pay a premium for, quote, innovation. I'm in the Warren Buffett camp of fundamental value innovation in this regard. So again, in the spirit of Gedanken experiments here, I just want to have in the back of your mind moving forward this question. How can we make a $5,000 experiment worth $100,000 in fewer than 100 days? 20-to-1 returns, nice venture returns. That's the framework. How can a portfolio of $5,000 experiments, cheap experiments, unlock $10 million of value for Thomson Reuters in a year? These are the kinds of constraints, design constraints, innovation constraints, design of experiment constraints I'd like you to be thinking about as we go forward. Okay? Now, the reason why I can have this kind of conversation with you in 2015 or 2005 is because of, these guys. Gordon Moore, Moore's Law, Bob Metcalfe, Metcalfe's Law, what we are all living through, what you have all taken advantage of and are deservedly scared by, are the kinds of disruptions in value creation and innovation opportunity facilitated by networks, software, silicon, fiber, etc. There's an exponential-oriented economics that these technologies enable, and something that used to be kind of expensive is becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, technically cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. How do we take advantage of that? Do we take advantage of it? Do we have legacy cultures and processes that get in the way of evaluating how we should be investing in innovation and the media and mechanisms that enable the acceleration and value of that innovation to occur? Price is what you pay, value is what you get. I can look every one of you who has an iPad, iPhone, or Android at your disposal, I can say with a high degree of confidence, you got a pretty good price for that. I mean, the richest people in the world didn't have that a decade ago. Now, some of the poorest people in the world have the same technology that you do. Are you getting value from it? Are you getting value from it? Forgive my Econ 101 indifference curve here, but now we're not just moving along. We have a problem, we want to analyze it. We have an opportunity, we can analyze it. I'm saying, and organizations do some tests and stuff, I'm saying when we explore how do we get value from something, we do analysis, experiment. It used to be what's the bundle? We move along the curve, what's the best mix? I'm saying, even in this era of big data, that when you disrupt the costs and prices associated with experimentation, you got to shift in the curve. It's not just a marginal rate of substitution, you're on a different curve. Don't be making investments on this curve when you should be on this one. I think there are serious cultural issues in that regard. So another more polite exponential way of saying this is, I'm going to say, Thomson Reuters, you're going to do the analysis that you do anyway. I've given up, I've worked with enough large organizations to abandon hope that you're going to abandon traditional ways of analyzing things. Okay? I'm a preacher, not a martyr in that regard. But I'm making a bit of a quantitative pun here. I think these new economics should encourage this kind of discipline. Let's call it the 80-20-20 vision. When you have an opportunity to explore or exploit, or a problem to solve or address, you're going to do the analysis. But at some time, sooner rather than later, get together with some colleagues and maybe a non-colleague and ask yourself, what business hypothesis can we test? What experiment can we run that might give us 80% of the essential information and insight into that problem or opportunity in 20% of the time at 20% of the cost? Do that as a discipline. I don't care whether it's a brave new product, a tweak of a service. What is not a quick and dirty, but a fast and frugal way of getting 80% of the way there? You're still going to do the analysis, but you know what? Sometimes experiment and analysis are complementary goods, not just competitive goods. That may or may not be true at Thomson Reuters, and I look forward to hearing your perception of this. But it may well be that a good experiment, an interesting provocative hypothesis, can go a long way to inform the kind of analysis you're going to be doing anyway. And back to Uncle Warren, risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. I think experimentation represents in this environment, represents a pretty bloody cost-effective way of getting a better insight into knowing what you're doing. So let's call this a different metric. Consider risk-adjusted return on experiment. Risk-adjusted. Everybody in this room is familiar with risk-adjusted return on equity? Risk-adjusted return on experiment is a metric for you all to play with, because you're also doing ROA, which is a risk-adjusted return on analysis. I'm not worried about you guys doing analysis. I'm worried about you guys doing experiment. And that's why, and this is probably the most controversial aspect of the books, but I'll be very brief on it. I think good ideas are completely overrated. Good ideas suck. There's a huge survivorship bias in regards to ideas. Oh, yeah, but everybody in this room has been through this situation, not once, not twice, but probably 7 or 8 times, where 8 months later, God forbid, 8 weeks later, 8 months later, or God forbid, 2 years later, you say to yourself, and sadly your colleagues or your spouse, gee, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Yeah. Okay? Screw good ideas. Don't ask people for good ideas. Ask them for testable hypotheses. Get people to communicate, collaborate, coordinate, and design around testable hypotheses, not good ideas. And one of these days, I will do a study about how long it takes to convert a good idea or any kind of an idea into a testable hypothesis. But I assure you that this is as much an issue in academe as it is in business. But when you have tenure, it matters less. Somebody should have laughed at that. Mona, you should have laughed at that. So, simple real-world examples of what I'm talking about. Forgive me for rounding up the usual suspects, but everybody here uses Google. You remember Marissa back in her Google as opposed to her Yahoo days. This was an experiment they actually discussed in 2009. And interestingly, it was serendipitously discovered. But every focus group that they had done with users said that users wanted more things returned on a search. And they did that. And then they discovered that there was drop-off in usage, faster abandonment. And they did this over and over. And they discovered, and you can, again, pun intended, you can Google this, they found a half-second delay led to a 20% drop-off. They began doing split A/B testing. All of a sudden, the DevOps people become a lot more important in that kind of environment. It's not the quantity of the search. It's not even the quality of the search. It's the speed of the search. Obvious. And the fact that they chose to discuss this is kind of revealing, because in the interest of full disclosure, I've done work with Google. It's what they don't discuss, which is so interesting. By the time they've disclosed something, they've well moved on. Same thing with this guy, Jeff Bezos. Screw the notion of Fire and Kindle as experiments. I like the recommendation engine notion of this. I think it's transformative. it was going to be killed by Amazon. Interestingly, for reasons not unlike the speed stuff. And here's the guy, you can read this on your own, but this is Greg Linden, who sadly went on to Microsoft, didn't have a good time there. Great guy. But they were afraid that recommendation engines would lead people to abandon purchases. So what they ended up doing was design an experiment to see whether advice, sorry about that, instead I prepared the feature for an online test. I wanted to measure the sales impact. They were able to design an experiment to demonstrate that recommendation engines, in fact, did not lead to a people abandonment of intended purchases, but actually led to more exploration and purchasing. This is my example. It's from my book, and it was a bitter, bitter example. It was one of the most traumatic experiences I had. Long story short, I'm just looking at the time here. Long story short, Blockbuster, this is in the turn of 1999, 2000. Every single survey that Blockbuster did with its customers revealed that the single thing that customers most hated about Blockbuster was late fees. And there was this startup called Netflix, and they branded themselves, now look where they are, but they branded themselves around no late fees. That was literally their brand. That was their brand and source of differentiation. And so the part of the problem was that literally 22 to 25% of Blockbuster's pre-tax profit came from late fees. It was a great business model. You do nothing and you get paid for it. Sign me up. But not being stupid people, they realized that this was not a sustainable situation, and they cast a wide net of people to suggest ways of dealing with this. And I spent some time, I went to stores, and again, long story short, I did, my recommendation was, let's do an experiment. Let's do an experiment. Let's ask people for, this is 1999, 2000, let's ask people for their email addresses. And the night before their videos come due, we'll send them an email to remind them. Nice, care for your customer, loyal, not expensive to run. Well, number one, you learn, will people give email on and I presented, and this was a loyalty. You would learn a lot. I make this presentation to a group not unlike this, about 8 or 9 people in the room, and these people looked at me as if I had peed on their carpet. They were not going to do that experiment. They were not going to do that experiment. Despite the fact they could learn, and despite the fact that I'd done back of the envelope stuff saying it would cost less than $10,000 to run, they would not do the experiment. Now, ultimately, and many of you know this story, they ended up paying hundreds of millions of dollars in fines to 3 states' attorneys, blah, 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 and ultimately, of course, they're out of business. And yes, did I feel a bit of Schadenfreude? I even waved, yes, I did feel, I'm not ashamed to say that I felt a bit of Schadenfreude on that. But it was a traumatic experience that I learned a lot from, because even though I had done my best to design a fast, cheap, simple, high-impact experiment that directly related to the core issue that they were dealing with, there was resistance. There was resistance. Even though I had eliminated time and money as the issue, there was resistance. Even though there was a clear value proposition, there was resistance. So if I can be permitted to sound a little cynical, we talk about, the importance of empowering people and innovation, being creative and all this. My view is, if you really want to understand your innovation culture, whatever comes after "we can't do that because" is your innovation culture. We can't do that because legal won't let us. We can't do that because it's too expensive. We can't do that because it'll take too long. We can't do that because it would tick off our biggest customer. Then, boy, experimentation turns out to be a very interesting way to do rapid diagnostics about what your innovation culture will or will not do. Resistance is by far the clearest window into understanding an innovation culture, your innovation culture. Not the quality of your people, not the quality of your ideas. The nature of resistance to testable hypotheses that on the surface don't look to be that expensive, that timely, or that risky. And so I'm here to say to you that I'm not one of these people who says, give me money. My view is the greatest frustrations that I deal with when I work with organizations and with my exec ed students, they're organizational and cultural. They're not technical or financial. As my dad was saying to me, you ready to stop banging your head against the wall because when you stop, it feels good. So these are cultural issues. Are you doing an experiment to extend your values or to challenge them? I'm sorry. This is the cultural issue here. And I'm now old enough to say that culture eats strategy for lunch. Do I take strategy seriously? Yes, I do. Do I take culture seriously? More seriously? Yes, I do. Perhaps that will be part of the conversation going forward. So I think going forward, we need to talk about what kind of investment and what kind of culture do we have in the experiments business. I want everybody in this room to think of themselves for the next 10, 15 minutes as a CEO, the Chief Experiments Officer. What's the deliverable? A portfolio of testable business hypotheses that matter. That matter. Now, we can argue about what matters. We can argue about what's testable. But again, not science, not technical, business hypothesis here. What's a portfolio? It's a bundle of experiments bound together by a value-driven theme. It's a theme. You're investors. You're a portfolio. What's the theme for your portfolio? What's a hypothesis? We're going to get to the big data stuff in a moment. But I think correlation is the devil. Correlation is the devil. Correlation of 0.6 and 0.7 are used as an excuse to say, screw it, we don't understand it because the correlation is strong enough. Screw R. Sorry for the quasi-quants in the room. Not the language, by the way, the coefficient. I like R. So my point here is a very simple one. I think we look for experimentation to gain understanding of the underlying mechanisms of value discovery and creation. What's an experiment? Structured, easily replicable process to test a hypothesis. And this is key. This is one of the biggest areas where I run across cultural issues. And what is that? Really good people want to solve the problem. They want to solve the problem. Don't solve the problem. Design an experiment to get you the insight, to get you that 80% that allows you to manage the risk more confidently and effectively going forward. And so the methodology that I've played with is I put together with large organizations what are called 5x5 X teams. You give 5 people 5 days from across the enterprise to come up with a portfolio of 5 experiments. No experiment can cost more than $5,000. None of them can take more than 5 weeks. And you have to show back of the envelope of 5 million or 50 million in savings or growth. No, I am not in love with the number 5. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm in love with constraints, design within constraints. And what you end up with, you have 5 teams, 5 times 5 is 25. Half the experiments are below the median. Ha ha ha. No? Okay. But you almost always run up, because you have talented people doing this, you always run up with 2 or 3 of the proposed experiments that have the CEO or the person running the business unit saying, wow, we can do that? Yes, we can, for $5,000 in 5 weeks. Because small group collaboration, tends to generate a lot. And if you generate a lot of these things, the law of large numbers and the central limit theorem, come to your benefit. You benefit from those tails. You don't give these teams money, cheap bastard that I am. They're cross-functional, they're well-regarded, hard deadline, the defined deliverable. They're self-managing. Don't hire McKinsey. I love McKinsey, by the way. They're terrific people. You present to top management, because guess what? Guess what I've discovered, even though I am not a people person? People like looking smart in front of their bosses. And bosses like it when their people are smart. It's a win-win, You'd be surprised. Okay, so where do these hypotheses come from? They can come from a great vision. Where else can they come from? What's the great problem? Not incremental, the urgent driving out the important. And they can come from great arguments, as we had at the Amazon circumstance. Okay? You can come up with hypotheses that are the intersection of these things. You are golden. Why? Because everybody in the organization is going to care about the experiments that you do. Not your good ideas, but oh my gosh, whether this hypothesis tests true or not, we want to know this. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. That's an innovation conversation worth having. Show me the hypothesis. Don't write it down. Write it down. And don't get caught up. I mentioned R. This is Ernest Rutherford. Not a shabby guy, Cavendish Lab. If your experiments need statistics, you ought to have done a better experiment. You can design these things so that you don't have to use R, pun intended. And I like this too. An experiment is not complete until it's been expressed in complete, simple, and correct English. There's a communications aspect here. And this is a physicist, for God's sake. And what is the contemporaneous update of this? We're back to Mr. Buffett. Don't do equations with Greek letters in them. I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever, but I'm saying for the purposes of this methodology. I want you people to leave thinking about what would it mean to become Warren Buffett of experimentation. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the key learnings and heuristics that I've found working with people on this. Not all of this is in the book. This is sort of thinking for you how I would update and upgrade some of these things, and we can discuss this in the questions. Analyze less, experiment more. Privilege, to show you that I am an academic, privilege testable hypotheses over good ideas. Celebrate creative constraints, different dimensions, time, not just money. Make experiments social. You got Yammer, you got Chat. What's the internal tool here? Jive, also very good. Socialize these things. Have great arguments and debates about the hypothesis and the experimental design. Do the experiments that matter most. Insights first, solutions later. It amazes me the number of people who want to go straight to the solution. Oh, we'll stumble across an insight along the way. No, design for insights. And track the hypothesis trajectory. If you look at the nature of the hypotheses that you're coming up with 6 months from now versus now and a year from now, are we focused more on customers? Are we focused more on technology? What an interesting mapping of great vision, great arguments, great problems that the organization is having. But I want to remind you, people aren't lab rats. People are not lab rats. Your customers and your colleagues are not people upon whom experiments should be done. You want a different level of participation than this creature, this rodent, has. So there is a certain crowdsourcing aspect to this. So just to quickly head to the conclusion, I believe that all of this has to be done with the knowledge that there's a different, forgive me, innovation paradigm going forward. When we were in school, everybody talked about innovation being the result of research and development. That's Bardeen, Bratton, and Shockley, Bell Labs, the, again, paradigm of traditional R&D. Fantastic, along with Cavendish Labs, one of the great R&D organizations in the world. Well, are organizations in the world. But you know what? Network organizations change things. We are shifting from R&D to experiment and scale, ENS. Networked organizations allow us to do small-scale experiments, scale them up 10 to 10 squared, 10 to the third, 10 to the fifth. Whoops, we have a problem. Bring it back down to 10 to the third. I think we're moving into an area of accordion innovation, up and down. And we learn as we do these iterations. But the unit of analysis doesn't become the product. The unit of analysis doesn't become the research. The unit of analysis becomes the way we instantiate a hypothesis and experiment and iterate and learn from those experiments. I'm here to say big data requires little experiments. I'm not worried about your ability in an era of petabytes to find correlations, spurious or otherwise. What I'm worried about is will you concomitantly invest in the experiments to understand and gain insight into the underlying mechanisms that create those correlations. And now we're in an era of machine learning, etc. what happens to your innovation process and culture, not when you're doing a dozen or 100 experiments, but 10,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000 of them. You're doing this in the big data realm. What about big little experiments? How do we invest in that resource? What does machine learning mean in this context? Are we just looking for patterns? Or AH versus I? What does AH stand for? Automated hypothesizing. Maybe you use machine learning to generate ideas and testable hypotheses for experimentation. Do I think this is 5 years away or 3 years away? No, it's here. It's here. And probably a couple of the people in this room both know a few of the hedge funds that are doing these sorts of things. The reason why we have to do it, and I'm just going to conclude with this, is Ronnie Kahavi was a very kind critic and reviewer of my book. We're poor at assessing the value of ideas. And so he would give talks at KDD where he'd post up these two interfaces on the website on the slide, find a house widget variations. The overall evaluation rate is revenue Microsoft generated every time a user clicks a button. Which one is better, A or B? Raise your right hand if you think A wins. If you think B wins, don't raise your hand if they're about the same. I won't plot this through you for a time. Okay? A was 8.5% better. This is for Office Online, OEC. Better? Which one's better? Right hand A wins, B wins. 64% worse. Huge. And this is simple A-B split testing. Homepage search box, taller. Okay? Overall evaluation criteria, raise it. If you raised any hand, the insight, stop debating. Don't guess. Do the bloody experiment. The economics are there for you. And this is my last quote on this from Alfred North Whitehead. We're not smarter than our parents. We're not smarter than our grandparents. We have better, faster, and cheaper tools, techniques, and technologies to gain insight, to look for value as well as truth. And what I love about this quote is that it's from 1925. Does anybody in this room believe, it's been a very exciting last decade, does anybody in this room believe that the next decade of technology innovation is going to be less interesting than the last decade? Shame on us if we don't take advantage of that. Those are my remarks. I look forward to your comments and questions, and I'm grateful for your time and attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Why don't we start and see if we don't have too much time, so why don't we start and see if we've got questions here in the room before I ask anything. Anyone? Wait for the microphone.
Hi. Quick question on culture.
Yeah, thank God. Yes.
So I agree with most of what you said.
That's what I like to hear.
But how do you generate a culture at a company where people can experiment as much as possible and not be afraid to fail?
You're conflating some things here. I think you should be afraid to fail. I think everybody should be afraid to fail.
I do too.
Why should we be afraid to fail? Because number one, we can look stupid. The other is, if there are costs associated with it. I can make everybody not afraid to fail. Thomson Reuters has announced Failure Champion. The biggest and most expensive failures at Thomson Reuters will get $100,000, €100,000, £100,000 bonus. You guys are going to be failing like crazy under those circumstances. The reason why I picked this methodology here is it's not if you design the experiment so that it's a no-lose proposition. If you can't afford to have it fail, it's not an experiment. It's not an experiment. All right? Now, the cultural aspect of it is, forgive the cliche, but I did say my background is behavioral economics. Recognition and reward. Stop rewarding good ideas Start rewarding testable hypotheses. Forbid people to propose an idea or a budget without an experiment attached to it. Okay? One of the genius and underappreciated, and this, I know this is a challenge for you, and it's a legitimate challenge, but one of the genius things that Amazon and Google did, which were hidden during their startup phase, which was completely different than how I was raised, and if you'll forgive me, probably how James was raised as well, is they combined production servers with tests. When we were dealing with things, if you were going to run an experiment, you didn't have to touch the production servers. They baked in capability to do experimentation from the get-go. So yes, that's where you have technical cultural issues as well. But recognition, rewards, and be afraid to fail, but define failure. It's not a failure if your experiment doesn't test valid. You've learned an awful lot. That's why design of experiment is a craft on these things.
As you're running these experiments,
right,
some of them are generating short-term value that is not the same amount of other priorities that the business has. Right.
Thank you.
How do you prioritize?
How do you prioritize? Oh my goodness. I am so grateful that I used the word portfolio. What kind of portfolio manager are you? Are you doing investments or are you a trader? I think the metaphor is more valid than a lot of people give it credit for. I think you want to scrape out what's the short-term, medium, and long-term investments. So what kind of portfolios? I've run a number of these 5x5s, and yes, there's some organizations that are intent on what's the quickest way we can have an impact on the organization. Others are trying to illustrate a broader issue, they're trying to, I don't want to say change the mind of the organization, but enhance the awareness of the organization around a certain kind of an opportunity. I'll give you one serious example of that. Boston Hotel Organization, they were new location. They basically, long story short, they did a simple experiment where they posted on their homepage the ability to rent their meeting rooms. And it turns out that they surfaced all manner of local people in that regard, because usually that's 4 or 5 clicks in, or nobody thought. Simple experiment. That was both short-term and long-term. It flushed out various and sundry people. The downside in the examples I'm giving you is that they're more web-oriented, but you're an IT organization. But the way I would reframe the question is, if we put together 5x5 teams, what would generate the most value for Thomson Reuters? Experiments that are designed for near-term gain and insight, mid-term, or long-term? Mona might be interested in some of those.
So you've worked with a lot of companies, and you recognize that you're not going to get these companies to throw away analysis culture. How do you...
Exactly right.
So what are the most best examples you've seen where companies have managed to move, at least move the needle from analysis to experimentation culture?
It's not... It's a simple question that, unfortunately, and I hate this word, requires a nuanced answer. There's an industrial company that I did work with that was heavy analytics. It's an engineering company. And they could not do an experiment they never did experiments. They did pilots and tests. It was always minimum of 50,000. You always had to get approval at the very highest levels. We did a offsite. And I want to stress, by the way, this is not me. This is just simple facilitation. What was the big problem? Maintenance issues. Their scarce resource were maintenance people for the stuff that they do. They do analytics for predictive failure, but stuff happens. So, and sometimes their remote diagnostics don't work. The experiment they proposed, and I just discovered that it worked very well. Can we get people to take pictures of the product and upload them? And so they had people do it. And now somebody from Clever IT said, oh, maybe we should not just use that to help determine which repair people to send out, but maybe we can use those photos to train a classifier and feed it back in. So the trick is, and it is a trick, the trick is not either or, It's how do you use cheap experiments to add value to the sunk cost or the ongoing investment in your analytics culture. Okay? And the one last thing I'm going to say on this is, I think one of the bad things about analytics cultures is that they have false confidence and they don't do experiments, they go straight to pilots. Because we have the data, we can do that. Why are you turning down, remember University of Chicago, 2 University of Chicago economists are walking on the sidewalk, it's a $20 bill on the sidewalk. Oh, don't be, it can't be real. There's no there's no such thing as free money. There's a lot of free money. Why? Because we're stuck in legacy analytic culture. We're not thinking, oh my gosh, the economics of experimentation have changed. We can get more value for money from both if we do simple experiments.
So a lot of the examples that you gave were where companies are operating in an e-commerce or a digital environment, right?
Right.
So the business...
Hold on a second. The example I gave of the industrial engineering company is not.
Okay.
But go ahead.
But most of them were,
Yes.
right? So in the business unit in which I operate, we do not transact digitally, right? All of our sales occur through a direct sales force. Our sales cycle is quite long. Meaning when you design these experiments, first of all, human beings are part of the process. Inherently, the treatment in the experiment differs, right, by individual. Secondarily, your route to results is long.
Right.
So how do your learnings kind of apply in this context? Sure.
We've dealt with longer life cycle. This is going to sound like a cop-out. I'll begin with the immediate cop-out. Spend a few minutes looking at the book. The default cop-out is, I would not play any kind of, how do you do this? I'd say, what are the big arguments in your organization? What is the great vision in your organization? What is the great problems in the organization? And get your people to design experiments. Ask them, what's the hypothesis we need to test? The issue for me is, and it connects to the question that this gentleman asked, it may well be that you can't run a fast experiment, or your notion of fast because the tempo of your business is a little bit longer. But I'm pretty confident, it has been my experience that people, when given the opportunity to creatively collaborate around the design of hypotheses and cheap experiments, you get a lot of value from that. You should do a workshop on that issue. By the way, you're in a no-lose position. Let's say you get people together and you do this, and nobody comes up with anything. I think that's going to tell you something about your innovation culture. And you may be the kind of organization that should be hiring McKinsey under those circumstances.
More questions?
You talked a lot about technology innovation, changing the market paradigm for different industries. And to react to that, a lot of companies are working with organizations like Techstar to start in-house accelerators, whether Ford or Verizon and other places. How do you think of those activity in the context of the principle and the experimentation you outline here?
I am completely supportive of traditional, conventional thinking, because there's a reason why it's traditional and conventional thinking. Your opportunity to differentiate is going to be more challenging. So the suggestion I would offer, just to link between the question that lady asked and the question that you asked regarding external venturing and partnering and being a part of an accelerator, I would say if my free recommendation to Thomson Reuters is you should put together an internal Kickstarter program. You should have people design experiments and proposals and to see whether it would be internally funded. You can create a fake currency, you can create a real currency, you can have the board vote shares for this. And this is a way of creating a decision market inside. You're not a small organization, you're a global organization. So I am not worried about the fact that there are smarter people and entrepreneurial people outside of Thomson Reuters. If I were Thomson Reuters, I would worry about empowering the intelligent and energetic and entrepreneurial people you have inside the organization so that they don't leave me, for better opportunities. I think you want to create all manner of mechanisms to make people look smart, be smart, and be recognized and rewarded for those things.
Yeah. Can you give us some more examples about testable hypotheses? In the business unit I come from, we've tried to do some work sessions, and inevitably it starts to get into pilots. It starts to get into, and then the trying to do something cheap gets very difficult, and people are like, we need $100,000 to do anything. So what is meaningful at $5,000 level that you're making progress? Are you just talking about, a survey with a customer? What's the level of
surveys aren't experiment? No.
Yeah. Could you give us more insight on that?
Yeah. I was surprised that you said $100,000. I would have thought for Thomson Reuters it would be 50. Everybody has mobile phones. I mean, I'm going to say, what could you put a QR code on? What app could you adapt? Could you reskin to do something, internally or externally? But again, I want you to begin. By the way, this is the biggest internal debate I've had with myself, and I vacillate. I cannot figure out for the life of me whether you get more value from beginning with the cheap experiment or beginning with the rigorous and framed hypothesis. For you folks, I would focus on the hypothesis. I think that you're an example of that takeaway, socialize the experiment. You want to socialize the hypothesis. You basically say, no, it's not going to be 5,000 for you. What you're going to say is, we will give $5,000 to the people who come up with an experiment that costs less than $10,000 to run for this hypothesis. Because that hypothesis is going to be so important to you. That's not a 6-figure hypothesis, that's a 7 or 8-figure issue. Everybody in your organization wants to know the underlying causal mechanism there. Okay, that's sort of where I would begin. But the notion of, and the book elaborates on this, coming up with hypotheses, getting people who are used to thinking in terms of ideas and pilots to thinking in terms of hypotheses is like getting classical musicians to become jazz musicians. The instruments are the same, the notation is the same, but the fingering and the behaviors and the way you listen are different. That's a hard problem. You know what I do with hard problems in large organizations? Share it. Share it. I guarantee you, I promise you, that if you come up with a decent enough hypothesis, there are at least 7 or 8 people in Thomson Reuters who can tell you stuff, quote, for free that you would not have come up with otherwise. And that, by the way, that's a challenge for somebody like James, on CTO. To what extent do our internal markets affect our ability to serve our external markets? Sorry for that long-winded answer.
I have a last one, which is linked to this one. So why is it so hard for a large organization to give up this notion that they should be sourcing ideas from their employees and then get through it yet another stage process? Why is it so hard to give that up? Well, clearly you and many of us have figured out that process doesn't work.
Well, let's clarify. It's not that the process doesn't work. It's that that process has hit diminishing returns. It's becoming less and less valuable. I will give you my father was fond of saying there are always 2 reasons for something: the good reason and the real reason. The good reason is, I think that most organizations hire people to do their jobs, not hire people to have them become better, more creative, more innovative people. The real takeaway from the 5x5, by the way, is people like it when they're given the opportunity to look smart and people are investing in their innovation capabilities. I think the real reason is top managements, for completely understandable reasons, want to control what's going on, and they're reluctant to trade off control and move into a mode where they're influencers rather than controllers. Some of this is legal and compliance because of accountability and responsibility. Others is people as a general rule, who run something. I love my wife. My wife is at a C-suite, but my wife, you know, I'll conclude by on a politically incorrect note. We had an argument about the phrase "ban bossy." She's bossy. Bosses like to boss. I don't think that's a profound insight. Bosses that care about value creation and valued, they have an indifference curve. I can be bossy, I can get more value. Bosses that slip down that curve and say, you know what? If I shift from control to influence, I can unlock and facilitate new value creation that will make me look smart, make everybody look smart. It's a win-win. They'll do it. There's still the legacy culture because it's easier to stick with what you know than even to do fast, cheap, simple experiments. Sorry.
Great. I'm afraid we're out of time. It has been very interesting and thought-provoking, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.